I'd now like to turn to our guest speaker, Rebecca Abrams. Now, Rebecca is a British author, teacher, and journalist. She's author of Touching Distance, The Jewish Journey, When a Parent Dies, 3 Shoes, 1 Sock, and No Hairbrush. And last year, she took us on a Jewish journey through the objects of Jewish interest at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. She's written a poem, The Pied Piper of COVID. She is a tutor on the Masters in Creative Writing course at the University of Oxford, and she's a regular literary critic for many journals, but mostly the Financial Times. We're absolutely delighted to have you back, Rebecca, and she's going to talk to us about Licoricia of Winchester, the rise and fall of a remarkable Jewish businesswoman. Over to you, Rebecca.
Thank you very much, Alan, and it's a real pleasure to be talking to B'nai B'rith again. I think actually I was trying to remember, but I'm actually speaking to you not from Oxford, where I live, or from Winchester, which is obviously where my new book is based mostly, but from Cornwall, where there is, of course, a very interesting Jewish history down in Cornwall, which you probably know about. But I was here last year and went to the Jewish cemetery in Penzance, which is well worth a visit if you find yourself down in this neck of the woods. And it's just a sort of fluke that I'm here. But actually, last time I spoke to B'nai B'rith, not the Ashmolean tour, but like this on Zoom, I was also here in exactly the same place. And I was talking to you then about my book, The Jewish Journey. And I just wanted to just very quickly mention that I'm just going to move to screen share, actually, because I wanted to show you this. Hang on, sorry. Get there in a minute. So this was obviously The Jewish Journey, but then after the book after that, which came out during lockdown and didn't get very much coverage, but it's definitely a book that if you're interested in Jewish history, it's worth knowing about. It's Jewish Treasures from Oxford Libraries, which I co-edited with Cesar Merchant-Harmon, who's the Judaica curator at the Bodleian. And this is actually, it's a wonderful book about all this extraordinary collection of Judaica that's in the Bodleian, one of the top collections of Judaica in the world. And this book tells the stories of the people who collected them over the centuries and what they collected and why they're of such significance to Jewish knowledge. But of course, that's not the book we're here to talk about this evening. And this is the book that I'm going to be talking to this evening. And this just come out just last week. This week it's not. It's got a slightly movable publication date, but I think it's sort of on its way out into the world. And it's called Licoricia of Winchester: Power and Prejudice in Medieval England. And that is the topic of this evening's talk. Now, it feels particularly appropriate to be talking to you on this particular week of the year, because throughout the Jewish diaspora, throughout the world, apart from Israel, we've just been reading Emil, the Torah portion Emil. And in 1287, 800 years ago, we know that the Jews of medieval England were, of course, reading the same portion this time in May. We actually know that they should have been doing this, but we have evidence of it from a small piece of medieval graffiti that was scratched on the wall of Winchester Castle, and records, in fact, that on that particular Shabbat, tragically, all the Jews of England had been taken hostage and imprisoned. Why? Well, to force them to pay a tax demand by the crown, by the king, for £12,000, which was a ludicrously high sum, because the jury was, in fact, virtually impoverished by that stage. Less than £5,000 was collected, was raised, and as a result, the entire jury was imprisoned to compel them to pay whatever they could. How do we know this? Well, because of this bit of graffiti, which was inscribed in Hebrew, and it reads, "On Friday, eve of the Sabbath, in which the pericope Emor is read, all the Jews of the Isle were imprisoned. I, Asher, inscribed this." And I won't go into the significance and of why he might have written that, but I mean, it is a very interesting story in its own right, and I do write about it in the book. One explanation is simply that he was, as the head of the community in Winchester, it was partly his responsibility to make sure that the Jews, even if they were locked up in prison, didn't lose track of the day, so that they would know when to observe Shabbat. Obviously very important, and Emil particularly explicitly refers to this commandment to observe the Sabbath as a day of solemn rest, a holy convocation. Emor is also really relevant to the situation that Asher and the other Jews would have found themselves in at that moment, because it's the parasha that talks about the appropriate punishment for, or retribution rather, for blasphemy, murder, and harm to person and property. I think for me, what's so powerful about this little bit of graffiti which survived, although I'm not sure where it is now, I think it's been lost now, but we have records of it, is that this inscription is a very rare example of a medieval English Jew speaking directly to us across the centuries, all the more poignant because Emor is Hebrew for speak. And this is this man Asher speaking out, and his rage and despair are really still audible centuries later. What's particularly remarkable is that we know who Asher was. This was the youngest son of Licoricia of Winchester. His father was Licoricia's second husband, the leading Jewish magnate David of Oxford. And Asher spent most of his life in Winchester, and he was obviously still there in 1287, but he was born in around 1243, so we know how old he was, for instance, when he wrote that inscription. Born in around 1243 in Oxford, in the grand stone mansion that belonged to David, and which is now the site of the town hall on St. Aldate's. But Asher is not the focus of our attention this evening. The person I want to talk to you about is his mother, the glamorously named Licoricia of Winchester. So who was Licoricia? Well, she was a medieval Jewish financier. She was, at her height, one of the richest and most successful female financiers in England. She was married twice. She was widowed twice. She was the mother of at least 4 children. She's been described by the historian Robert Stacey as the most important Jewish woman in medieval England, yet until very recently, she'd been largely forgotten by history. She was probably born at the very beginning of the 13th century, and her long and eventful life spanned 7 decades, incredibly long-lived for that period of time. 7 decades, 2 civil wars, and the reigns of 3 monarchs, King John, Henry III, and Edward I. She rose from obscure origins, we don't know very much about her parentage, to become, as I said, the most successful Jewish businesswoman in medieval England and one of the richest women in medieval England. As her toponym suggests, she spent most of her long life in the royal city of Winchester, but she also had close personal and professional connections to Canterbury. In fact, she's also referred to sometimes as Licoricia of Canterbury, and also to Oxford, where, as I've said, she lived between 1242 and 1244. This statue of Licoricia was unveiled in February this year in Winchester by the sculptor Ian Rank Broadley, on what's now called Jury Street, which was the street where she lived in Winchester. Her first husband was called Abraham of Kent, and the fact that he's known by the name of a place indicates that he was probably also a reasonably successful businessman or moneylender in his own right. They were probably married in around 1215, and they had 3 sons: Isaac, who was mostly known as Cockerel or Cock; Benedict, who was also known as Baruch, although he was nearly always called Benedict, and Lombard. And she possibly also had a daughter named Belia. We're not quite sure. There's only one reference to Belia, and that's from much later in Licoricia's life. And Belia may have been her daughter-in-law. She's referred to as her daughter, but she may have been her daughter-in-law. Anyway, by 1225, if not earlier, the family had settled in Winchester. Just see what the next slide is. So this is a slide of the Jewish communities in medieval England from 1070 when they first arrived to 1290 when they left. So this is sort of at its height. And so you can see we've got Winchester. Where have we got? We've got Winchester here, Oxford here, Canterbury here. So you can see that just in the three places we know she was connected with, she was moving across quite a swathe of England. And we also know there was also quite a lot of connection and movement between these different juries. They weren't sort of little segregated, isolated sort of communities. They were all dealing with each other and talking to each other and moving around. They had to have permission, royal permission, to live in these places, and they were only allowed to live where there were arcas, so these community chests. So they were constrained in where they could live, but we know there was quite a lot of movement between Jewish communities in these different places. So that's just to give you a sense of Licoricia's carbon footprint, sort of pretty much all across this swathe of southern England. We don't know, as I said, where her parents came from, but she herself first enters the records in January 1234, when she is described as the widow of Abraham of Kent. So we know that her husband had already died by then. She was probably in her early 30s at this point, and she was evidently already a successful moneylender. The records for that year record that Petervin and Licoricia, Jews of Winchester, were ordered to let a certain Hugh Sansever off paying the interest on £10 that they'd loaned him. Now, £10, if you remember, I mentioned that huge sum of £12,000, which was the final tax demand of the Jews in 1287. £10 also was a huge amount of money. So at that time, it was a large enough amount to buy a brand new, fully fitted ship, just to give you a sense of the scales. A second mention of Licoricia in the same year records that William of Hampton, which is the name for Hampshire, owed her 10 marks, which he was ordered to repay at the rate of 2 marks a year. So, you know, you can see from the records that sometimes people are being let off amounts that they owe to Jewish moneylenders, and sometimes they're being ordered to pay the amounts that they're owed. So it was a kind of quite a fluid situation. By the end of the 1230s, Licoricia had moved into the major league and established herself as a regular at the royal court in Winchester, where she was making loans to senior clerics. She was dealing with the Bishop of Winchester. She was lending to local landowners and members of nobility. And most extraordinary of all, she had secured the patronage of the king himself, Henry III. And here is a not brilliant picture of Henry being crowned, looking very pious. But he was very pious, but that doesn't mean he behaved in a decent way towards the Jews. He did, however, clearly have a close relationship, close sort of a working financial relationship. I'm not suggesting any sexual impropriety, but he definitely, he and Licoricia had quite a close connection, as will become clear as this story goes on. She would have been as a major moneylender in Winchester, and as I said, a favourite of the king himself. She would have been a regular at the Great Hall in Winchester Castle, which looked pretty much like it does today. King would have been sitting on his throne and would have received people at his open court, and she would have been amongst the gathering there. And we know she was there on a regular basis. How exactly did Licoricia manage to establish herself in this way? Well, it's a bit of a mystery. All that we know about her comes from pretty dry accounts in the financial and legal records, which are penned by clerks who weren't always entirely literate and often made mistakes and changed the names of the people they were writing about, spelt them differently at different times, and sometimes even changed the gender of the person that they were writing about from one entry to the next. In addition, many of the records of this period have been lost or destroyed. Now, we don't have any of Licoricia's bonds, but we do have this example of a contract between her son Cockerell fee Licoricia, it says there, and this character Rumbridge from 1250, which is in the National Archive. And there are a few records relating to her sons. There are several of these contracts relating to her son's business activities, because they all went on to be involved in finance in some way, or else to be working as attorneys, actually, so they crop up in the financial records fairly regularly. But what we do know is that as a woman in a rigidly patriarchal society, and as a Jew in a deeply Christian country, openly prejudiced against Jews by this point, it's really beyond question that Licoricia must have been both very determined, very skilled, and very brave, I think. Financially savvy, politically adept, and blessed with plenty of chutzpah. I would just like to say a word more about money lending. So in a pre-banking world, I mean, it was one of the things I found quite challenging when I was writing the book, was trying to get my head around what on earth the sort of situation was in sort of medieval economy. The Jews definitely played a kind of important part in the English medieval economy. But in a pre-banking world, I think what we need to understand is that money lending was an essential part of that economy. It couldn't function without money lending, and particularly so in England, where the king taxed the elite very heavily, the social elite, so they then needed to raise money from money lenders in large sums. And that was quite an unusual arrangement. Now, Christian money lending from the 13th century on, the early 13th century on, was really strongly discouraged. So there are quite a lot of big Christian money lenders and a lot of low-level Christian money lenders in the 12th century, but by the 13th century that had been cracked down on by the church. So the role fell increasingly to Jewish money lenders. There was the market, there was no competition really, and also Jews themselves were encouraged into that, or squeezed into that market. Again, medieval Jews in England did lots of other things as well. The majority of them weren't moneylenders, contrary to the myths and the caricatures. But nevertheless, the role of moneylending did fall almost exclusively to Jews in England in the 13th century. And they were then used pretty ruthlessly to advance Christian ambitions, social, political, and financial. I just want to show you just a couple of other examples of slides. So this is the Hebrew star, the contract of somebody called Jacob of Oxford, who was a major property owner. He dealt more in property than in financial loans. And this is his contract with Walter de Merton for the exchange of a property, which then became a key part of Merton College, the newly founded Merton College. And in the next slide, you can see his seal, which is a lion rampant, reference to the Lion of Judah. And the inscription around the edge says in Latin, Jacob the Jew of Oxford. So, and then here is another one. Women also could, Jewish women had quite a lot of financial freedom, more so than Christian women, and particularly if they were widowed, but not necessarily. Even married women were quite active financially. And this is the contract belonging to a woman called Mildegod, another Oxford Jew. The Oxford Jewry has very, very well preserved heritage. This one's in Magdalen College now. And if we go to the next slide, you can see her seal, much less grand than Jacob's, but nevertheless, rather nice. It's got a running bird here. I don't know if you can see a sort of two-legged bird running along. Yes, so okay. So Jews, also it might be useful for you to know, Jews actually constituted a very small proportion, tiny proportion of the overall population of England in the Middle Ages, probably around 0.25%, which actually isn't that dissimilar to the figure in Britain today. But even at its peak in around 1240, the Jewish population in England was probably around 5,000 people. That was in around 1220, 1230, out of a population of about 5 million. By the 1280s, 1290, their numbers had dwindled to no more than about 2,000. But despite its relative insignificance numerically, the English Jewish community's combined wealth was at times equal to as much as 30% of the country's entire liquid capital, which does give you a sense of how important they were for the feudal economy. That said, most Jewish capital was concentrated in the hands of a very, very small number of people, probably no more than 10 or 15 families at any one time. The vast majority of Jews in medieval England were not rich. They were not even well off. They were actually as poor as most other people in England, which was to say very poor. Half the Jewish population at any point were too poor to pay taxes. Even for individual moneylenders like Licoricia at the very top of their game, or very top of the game rather, it was a high-risk enterprise. Fortunes could be wiped out in a second through swingeing taxations of the kind we've already heard about, levied by the crown on the Jews. These were known as tallages. Loans could be cancelled by the crown without warning, on a whim, and assets, property and bonds could be confiscated at a moment's notice as well. So Aaron of York, just to give you two examples, Aaron of York, who in 1241 was one of the wealthiest Jewish magnates in England, was bankrupted, completely wiped out by 1255 as a result of these tallage demands, these taxations from the king. The family of another leading Jewish magnate, Leo Episcopus of York, was likewise ruined. His family was ruined in 1244 by this vast sum of £7,000, which was imposed on his heirs after his death. So just hang on in your mind to that figure of £7,000 of inheritance tax, because we're going to come back to the problem of inheritance tax on Jews in a moment in the case of Licoricia. So yeah, so even very successful financiers were pretty precarious. And yet, despite these obstacles, by the time Licoricia was in her mid-40s, she had established herself as one of the country's leading financiers. She had business interests extending over several counties. She had properties in Winchester, Oxford, and other towns, and she had considerable status and influence as a result. She was not only the richest Jewish woman in medieval England, she was probably one of the most powerful. Was she exceptional or was she typical? Well, she certainly was exceptional as a woman and as a Jew in achieving this level of business success and financial wealth. But in other respects, I think it's really important to remember that she was not exceptional at all. So in her vulnerability to anti-Jewish restrictions, legislation, prejudice, hostility, attacks, and in fact wholesale massacres, she was no different from the rest of the Jewish community of 13th century England. And 13th century England was not a friendly place to be if you were Jewish, and things got worse and worse as the century progressed. But even before it became clear that this was really going to be a very difficult century for the Jewish people in England, personal disaster had struck Licoricia and her family in 1225. So when she was probably about 25 herself, so she was a young woman. And her husband, what happened in that year was that her husband, Abraham of Kent, was arrested along with 3 other Winchester Jews and accused of murdering a Christian child. We don't know exactly what happened to Abraham after that, but we do know that he was no longer alive by 1234 because, as I said, she's referred to in the records by then as the widow of Abraham of Kent. Now, in all likelihood, he was found guilty at trial and executed, leaving Licoricia a widowed mother with 4 young children to support, 3 or possibly 4. And this is the building you're looking at now, which is called the Old Jailhouse, because this was where the 13th century jail stood in Winchester at the time that Abraham of Kent was accused of blood libel accusation and arrested and imprisoned. And he would have been imprisoned in the building that sort of stood on this site, or just behind this site. And this is the street that this is on, for those of you who don't know Winchester, is called Jury Street today. In Licoricia's time, it was called Shoemaker Street. I won't try to pronounce that in Anglo-Saxon, but it basically was Shoemaker Street. And a lot of the Jewish people in Winchester lived on this street, and Licoricia included. So this is, and in fact, at a later date, she lived in the house opposite the jailhouse, where her first husband was arrested and imprisoned, and probably where he was executed, because the gallows stood immediately outside the jailhouse. But there's a 9-year gap, between 1225 when we hear about his arrest and 1234 when we find out that he's dead, and that's a tantalizing gap. How did Licoricia and her children survive financially after Abraham's death? How his chattels would have been confiscated if he was found guilty of murder. I mean, there was almost certainly no evidence that he'd done it, but that didn't matter. Once a Jew was accused of murdering a Christian child, it was pretty hard for them to get off. They did sometimes, but it was not, the odds were not stacked against them. Also, I'd also like to know, how was she affected by his conviction and his arrest and his death, whether it was by execution or some other cause? And how did she establish herself as a moneylender? Did she have access to money of her own? How and when did she launch her independent business activities? And where did she learn the necessary financial skills to become so successful so quickly? Well, we don't know, is the answer. But it's but you know, we can speculate. And one theory that's been proposed is that her father may have put some money, as sort of what's the word? Ring fence some money in her ketubah in the eventuality of widowhood. Because that was we know that was done in the Middle Ages. So that might be one example. One explanation. There was also another very important Jewish medieval female moneylender in Winchester at this time called Cara, and Cara of Winchester was a sort of big matriarch in the town. And it's also possible her daughter-in-law Belia was a good friend of Licoricia's, and it's possible that Cara may have come to Licoricia's aid after Abraham was arrested. And the reason for that is that one of the other people arrested at that time was one of Cara's sons. It's called Abraham Pinches. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce his name. It's spelled Pinche in the medieval record. So what we do know is that disaster struck the Winchester community again, the Jewish community again, in the early 1230s, around the time that Licoricia begins to enter the record, when the scholar master, the head of the synagogue, Dulabane, fell ill and died, and Licoricia's friend Belia was Dulabane's wife. Dulabane was then replaced as head of the scholar by his brother, Abraham Pinches, who, as I said, had been arrested also on this blood libel charge back in 1225, but let off. He was arrested again at this point, accused again of blood libel. Actually, he'd just been accused of a blood libel, arrested for a blood libel 3 years earlier, which he got off. And that was a really terrible case where there were awful rumours circulating about the way this child had been tortured. But then the child's mother actually came forward and confessed to the crime herself. So they were let off. But it seems that there was a bit of the people were mounting, local people, Christian people were mounting a case against Pinches because very shortly after he had been appointed as the scholar master, he was arrested again, this time accused of theft. And again, the trial was sort of stitched up, and he was executed in a very unpleasant way. His body was dragged around the town, and he was then hung on the gallows here outside this building, or what would have been the building here, opposite his own home, which was the house opposite, which was the house which the synagogue was attached to. And his body was not. The Jewish community were not allowed permission to bury Pinches' body in the Jewish cemetery. He was only allowed to be buried under the gallows, which, as I said, stood opposite his own house. So it's pretty grim. I think it gives you a sort of flavour of what, how Jews were being treated. What you're looking at now is where the synagogue would have stood. So the houses that you're looking at in the distance here are the back of the houses opposite the jailhouse, which is, as I said, was where Dulabane's house would have been, and then Belia's house, and then Pinches' house was passed on to him as the head of the scholar. And the synagogue stood behind the houses. This was very common in medieval England, but the synagogue would have to be entered through a private house, and it would stand at the back of the house, maybe underneath the house, or in land at the back of the house. So it was basically for safety. It was so that Jews could go to their place of worship without risking, without being very vulnerable to attack, or without just being very visible that that's what they were doing. So it was kind of privacy, really, as well as safety. The mikveh, we don't know where the mikveh was in Winchester. It may well have been also part of this site. And once the house was taken over by Licoricia, when she came back as a very wealthy businessman about 10 years later, she acquired this site. It may well be that she had the mikveh in this building, or it may already have been there. We don't really know. Now, what we do know is that in this very small, close-knit community, physically small, close-knit community, the deaths of these leading figures, Dulabane, Abraham of Ken, Abraham Pinches, would have really hit the community very hard. Licoricia included, but these men and their families were her friends, her neighbours, her colleagues, and her co-religionists. By the end of the decade, however, by the end of the 1230s, Licoricia, despite the challenges of widowhood, or perhaps because of them, both Licoricia and her friend Bellier had established themselves as very important moneylenders on the Winchester scene. In 1239, Licoricia, Bellier, and another of Clara's daughters, Blanche, all paid sums in the Winchester tallage, which was an indication of their success as independent moneylenders. In the early 40s, Licoricia made an interesting decision, which was, despite her success as a single woman, a single mother, independent businesswoman, she decided to remarry. She'd definitely been a widow on her own since the 1230s, since 1234, but in the early 40s, 1240, she decided to marry. And her second husband was the leading Jewish magnate, David of Oxford. Born and raised in Lincoln, David was originally known as David of Lincoln. He'd moved to Oxford by 1216 and changed his toponym from of Lincoln to of Oxford, which indicates that by that time he was already, pretty successful and important financier. He now wanted to be known as of Oxford. He needed to be known as of Oxford. The other thing I should say is that it means that if he moved to Oxford in 1216, it means he was in Oxford in 1222 for the Oxford Synod of 1222, which was when I gave a talk about this at Christchurch Cathedral last weekend at a special service of repentance, which some of you may have noticed or heard about, when the Church of England actually apologised for this synod, this synod of 1222, because it was when anti-Jewish measures were introduced formally into canon law for the first time, including the order that Jews must wear an identifying badge. So it was a very significant moment, really, a turning point in this codification of anti-Jewish prejudice and anti-Jewish measures into church law. So David would have been living in Oxford when that synod was held, took place, and passed those measures. In any case, by the time he and Licoricia met, which was probably in the early 1240s, he was established as one of the most influential and wealthiest Jewish men in England. Personal banker to Henry III and to Henry's sister, Eleanor de Montfort. Now, Eleanor de Montfort was married to Henry's bête noire, Simon de Montfort, who I'm sure you will know from your medieval history. Was a terrible figure, known now as the founder of Parliament, but for our purposes, he should be remembered as one of the worst anti-Semites that 13th century England came up with. There were quite a lot to choose from. So this picture that you're looking at here, this slide, is what David's house would have looked like. It survived into the early 18th century, and it was a very, very grand stone mansion. It was called the House with the Stone Chamber, and the cellar, the vaulted stone cellar, where probably was used as a storehouse, as a bank, a local bank, still survives. So you can go down into the town hall in Oxford. If you ask to go down into the stone vaulted cellar, it's still there, and that would, almost certainly have been attached to David's house. If we look at this next slide, and this is a picture by the wonderful historian Pam Mannix, who's painstakingly put together these pictures of medieval Oxford, different stages, showing all the properties that were owned by Jewish people at different stages in the medieval Jewish period. And what you can see, if you go to the top, there's a Fish Street is now called Great Jewry Street. Fish Street is now St Aldate's. And what you have where he says the precincts of the Dominicans here on the right, I don't know if you can see my cursor or not, but anyway, here, this is now Christchurch, okay? And this here, Isaac of Oxford's house with the stone chamber, that was the house that then, where David of Oxford lived and Licoricia lived as well. So, but not yet, because Licoricia and David haven't yet got together. Where did they meet? Well, we don't really know where they met, I'm afraid to say, but it's certainly very, very likely that they were both in Worcester in 1241 for the Great Parliament of the Jews, which had been called by Henry III to enforce a payment of his latest massive, terrible Jewish taxation. And a proclamation went out to the sheriffs of a number of counties, threatening them with dire consequences if the Jews failed to attend. And I thought I'd just read you a little bit to give you a flavour of how power operated in the 13th century, because there wasn't a lot of room for manoeuvre, really. So this is the king talking to the sheriff of Northamptonshire in a decree that he sent him. This is an order. The king to the sheriff of Northamptonshire, greetings. We command you, as you love yourselves and all yours, and so that we do not most grievously seize upon you by force, that you caused to come before us at Worcester on the Sunday next, before Ash Wednesday, 6 of the wealthier and more powerful Jews of Northampton, and from each town in your shire in which Jews dwell, 1 or 2 Jews, according to their numbers, to treat with us of their utility as of ours, knowing that unless these Jews come at the aforesaid time, we will so aggrieve you in consequence by your body and by your chattels that you will forever feel our hand to grieve you immoderately. So, the sheriffs of Nottingham, Cambridge, Lincoln, York, Bedford, Norfolk and Suffolk didn't have much choice in the matter, let's put it that way. As leading financiers, both Licoricia and David would certainly have been in attendance. Was this, it's not hard to see why they would have been attracted to one another. David was rich, powerful, and needed an heir. Licoricia was rich, powerful, and already had 3 or 4 children who'd survived to adulthood. Was this a love match or a strategic alliance? Well, we won't know that. We don't know that either. But certainly this was a Jewish power couple in the making. There was just one problem. David was already married, and his wife Muriel of Lincoln wasn't going anywhere without a fight. So what happened next was a tremendous scandal that embroiled the English Beth Din, the Paris Beth Din, and the King of England. Judaism in the 13th century didn't ban divorce on religious grounds, and consensual divorce was permitted. According to Talmudic law, a wife could be divorced without her consent, but unless she had committed a major offence, and that usually meant a sexual offence, the husband would have to pay back the full amount of the ketubah, which acted as a very effective deterrent in most cases. However, one of the 4 decrees which have been attributed, which is attributed to the medieval Talmudist Rabbeinu Gershom, who's 960 to 1040, was that contrary to Talmudic law, a woman could not be divorced without her consent. And by the 13th century, this had become the established custom amongst Ashkenazi Jews. So what happened when David initially went down to Canterbury and applied to the English Beth Din for permission to divorce Muriel, he was given permission. Muriel then strenuously objected. She was having none of it. She whipped up her family and friends in London to go off to France to petition the Paris Beth Din to overrule the English Beth Din, which it duly did. Now, the situation was quite complicated. The Jewish law on this subject was not actually entirely straightforward, and there had been a ruling which was to last for a set amount of time, that a woman couldn't be divorced without her consent, but that had expired in 1240. And so there was some ambiguity about what you could and couldn't do around this issue. It was not surprising that she went to Paris, because the Paris Beth Din had authority over the English Beth Din. They had for a long time been really effectively one community, separated by a little bit of water, the English Channel. But in the 13th century, they were functioning much more separately. But nevertheless, the Paris Beth Din was still a higher authority than the English Beth Din. David and Licoricia weren't really the kind of people to, let obstacles get in their way. So they then played a kind of really interesting card, which is they persuaded Henry III to intervene directly in the affair. Well, we're assuming that they got Henry III to intervene, because he did intervene, and it's not clear why he would have intervened if they hadn't actually asked him to. Both Licoricia and David were working closely with him as his financial advisor and financier. So what exactly did they say to him? Well, we don't know, but it's likely that they may have tactfully pointed out that the King of England should not be dictated to by Jews, and certainly not by Jews in another country. He also may have pointed out that the Jews in England were there to serve the King of England. This was stated in various royal charters, that the point of the Jews was to serve the King, and David was there to serve the King, and so not to serve the Paris Beth Din. So they were kind of very political issues, but it's also possible that they were genuinely trying to work out what the law was in this case. And Henry may have wanted the ruling of the English Beth Din to overrule Paris for various, for political reasons. The other question is that if the ruling of the Paris Beth Din won out, and David went ahead and ignored them and married Licoricia, divorced Muriel and married Licoricia, then the Paris Beth Din, by its own rulings, could confiscate his money. And his money was actually the king's money, because everything that the Jews owned was the king's property, including the Jews themselves. So the king had various reasons why he wouldn't really want this to go the way it was going. What he did was he upheld the English Beth Din's ruling, and he ruled that they should be allowed to marry. So what happened was 2 letters were issued. The first addressed to the leading members of the English Beth Din, threatening them with grave punishment if they interfered in any way with David's wish to divorce or marry. And the second letter, in August 1242, banning any further tribunals concerning the Jews of England. So that was again the king stamping his authority on things. Muriel and her supporters were ordered to appear before the king, acting regent, the Archbishop of York, to justify their appeal to the Paris Beth Din. And that letter ended by stipulating that David of Oxford shall not be coerced by the Jews to take or hold any woman to wife except of his own free will. In other words, Licoricia and David had got their way. And they were married soon after, probably in 1242. And a year after that, Licoricia gave birth to a 4th and final son, whom they named Asher. And he was always known, in fact, as Sweetman or Douceman. And this is the part of the statue of Licoricia that's now in Winchester. And yes, he is holding a dreidel. So installed in David's grand mansion on Fish Street, Licoricia was now the first lady of one of England's oldest and most securely established juries, also one of its safest juries. It was one of the few juries in medieval England that didn't have any attacks on its Jewish population, didn't have massacres on its Jewish population, partly because of this, there was close interaction between the scholars at the university and the Jewish community because of sort of fledgling Hebraism. But unfortunately for Licoricia, things looked really set fair for her. But in 1244, just 2 years after she married David, personal tragedy struck again, and this time in the form of David's death. So he suddenly died. He was probably quite a bit older than her, suddenly died, widowed again. Licoricia had a really different problem this time. The first time around, the problem was that she was probably left with no money at all. This time around, she had far too much money, and she had to pay this huge inheritance tax on that amount. She had to raise at least 1/3 of the total value of David's colossal financial estate. And if she failed, the crown would be entitled to confiscate the whole lot, and she and her family would be ruined completely. To ensure that she didn't sort of run away or hide the money or do there were no shenanigans, she was then taken hostage by the king and imprisoned in the Tower of London for the next 8 months. And let's just remember that she just had a little boy, she just had a baby. So we don't know whether he went with her or what happened, but she had a 1-year-old son. And she was a prisoner in the Tower of London for the next 8 months, while David's estate was being assessed. And eventually, again, I'd love to have been a fly on the wall at those conversations, but eventually she and David struck a deal. So she and Henry III struck a deal. The price of Licoricia being able to repurchase David's estate was set at 5,000 marks. Okay, remember that 7,000 marks, which had wiped out the magnate's family, Leo Episcopus of York, just that same year or the year before. 5,000 marks, and now of that 5,000 marks, 4,000 was to go directly to the building of Henry's pet project, which was a lavish new golden shrine at Westminster Abbey to Henry's idol, his patron saint, Edward the Confessor. And that shrine, of course, is still there to this day, and largely financed by money from Licoricia of Winchester. Licoricia also had to make an additional personal payment of another 1,700 marks, £2,500. Again, think back at that, £10 could buy you a big ship. And that was her personal contribution to this new chapel. So she had to contribute quite a lot of money to that chapel. What was in it for her? Well, it was a fantastic deal. She brokered a fantastic deal. In return for these payments, worth millions of pounds for sure, but she was allowed to keep the whole of David's estate, not just 2/3 of it. And still more astonishingly, she was let off paying taxes for the rest of her life. And as we've heard, taxation could ruin even the richest and most financially established people in the country. So to be let off paying taxes for the rest of your life is a pretty good deal, particularly because one of the outcomes of this Worcester Parliament in 1241 was that the king now had a very, very detailed picture of exactly where Jewish wealth was in the country and exactly what Jewish wealth there was in the country. And he proceeded for the next 10 years, 15 years, to savagely tax the Jewish population, really ruining whole communities. I think in the 1250s, with another taxation due, the head of the community of the whole country had begged the king to let the Jews leave the country rather than make them suffer and endure another punishing taxation. So Licoricia had really played a really good hand. She was released from the Tower, triumphant, fully independent, fabulously wealthy, and she returned to Winchester, where she was reunited with her sons, including little Asher. Her headquarters was, she set up her headquarters in her house in Drury Street, Shoemaker Street. She had extensive business interests, as I explained, across the southeast of England. And she also had frequent lawsuits. I mean, she clearly felt quite powerful at this point because there's a very sort of notorious case in the 1250s, early 1250s, called the Chalcott case, where she shows that she is revealed to have perceived herself really as above the law at this point, that she didn't feel the law applied to her, or that she could break the law with impunity, possibly because she knew she could count on Henry's backing, and this may be because she was really in Henry's favour, having enabled him to complete this wonderful shrine to Edward the Confessor. So the Chalcott case, this man called Thomas Chalcott was found drowned in his lake on his estate, and Licoricia, he owed Licoricia quite a lot of money, and in lieu of that unpaid loan, she just basically took over his estate, and she began selling off chunks of it. And this was completely against the law. And when a jury was assigned to try her, she was found guilty at trial. And Henry III intervened and just replaced the whole jury and called a second trial with what he felt was a more benign jury. In fact, that jury also found her guilty, and he then intervened again and capped the fine that could be imposed on her for her behaviour. So, again, there's a little tiny window onto what's going on at this point. It's quite interesting, it's quite revealing. Again, in theory, she should have been able to live out her life, the remainder of her life now, without too many worries, because she was financially pretty secure. But in reality, the following 3 decades took a very different turn due to events that were actually completely beyond Licoricia's control. From the 1240s on, or certainly from the 1250s on, England became an increasingly hostile environment for the Jews. There were these taxations I've mentioned. There were also constant sort of legislation, anti-Jewish legislation was introduced, which made it more and more difficult for Jews to function financially. And because of the political situation and the economic situation, England became more and more and more politically unstable, and there was more and more civil discontent, which all erupted in the 1260s in the Civil War, the second Civil War of the century, in fact, the Second Barons' War, led by Simon de Montfort, the king's brother-in-law, who was terribly anti-Jewish, terribly ambitious, and very ruthless. He led the country into civil war in 1264, and at the Battle of, Lewis, defeated Henry III and took over as de facto King of England. And his first act was to ban Jewish money lending. And his reign really unleashed a reign of terror for the Jews. There were massacres in counties across England, including in Winchester. So in 1265, Simon de Montfort's son, who was on his way to help his father at the Battle of Evesham, paused for 3 days in Winchester, where he and his men ransacked the town, looted the Jewry, and destroyed the Arca with all trace of the Jews' debts. And any Jew who wasn't actually locked up safely in the castle was murdered in cold blood, according to the chronicler Robert of Gloucester, who said, "All the Jews of the town he slayed each one, and wherever he found them he left alive not one." And that came fast on the heels of a whole series of other massacres in other towns, including London. Anti-Jewish persecution really just kind of, prejudice and persecution just sort of went hand in hand from there on as the country kind of lurched from one crisis to another. I won't sort of go into that in too much detail, but it's it was quite clear that the country became less and less hospitable, and it became less and less easy for Jewish people to kind of get on with their lives in England at this time. Things took a rapid downward turn in 1272 when Henry dies and his son Edward I takes over. And Edward I is again a kind of zealous and zealously anti-Jewish. Began his reign as he meant to go on. He was actually on crusade when he heard his father had died, which tells you sort of pretty much everything you need to know about him. But one of his first acts as king was to give his mother, Eleanor of Provence, permission to expel all the Jews from the counties, the English counties in her possession. In 1270, in fact, and then in 1273, the first year of his reign, he authorized a tax of 1/3 of all Jewish assets, which was the harshest tallage in over 30 years. And when these tallages were introduced, basically what happened was, people then had to raise this money. Christians had to raise this money. The way they did it was they went to the Jews, who then called in their loans. So it was a sort of knock-on effect, but the Jews were the kicking stool in the middle. And so every time there was a tallage imposed on anybody, there was a hike in hostility towards Jewish people and the kind of rising, spiking attacks on Jewish communities. And again, I'm not going to talk too much about Edward, but except to say that, of course, one thing he's very famous for, well, he's very famous for lots of anti-Jewish measures, but one of the next terrible things he did, so these are just some other things. This is Edward and Eleanor, by the way. This is 1275, he issued the Statute of Jewry, and the Statute of Jewry banned Jews from all forms of money lending. It froze interest on outstanding loans. It made it very difficult, it introduced new measures, made it very difficult to call in loans that were outstanding. It banned inheritance, it banned collecting interest on existing debts, it prohibited pawnbroking, and it imposed the wearing of the badge on every Jew in the country over the age of 7. So even children have now had to wear the badge. And he also made the big badge bigger, and he made it yellow. So, I mean, terrible. It was absolutely catastrophic. And this, you can see here it says the Statute de la Jewry. So many members of the Winchester Jewry had left the city by this time, although not Licoricia herself, but her sons Lombard had moved to Basingstoke. His son Solomon also left the city and moved to Odiham, and another of her grandsons, Aaron, moved to Canterbury around this time, along with his brother Cockerell and his sister Bellaset, and those 3 siblings were still living in Canterbury in 1290. But Licoricia stayed on in Winchester. She seems to have been quite badly affected by these events of these last years, not surprisingly. And in 1270, she failed to turn up at a legal hearing, claiming that she was too ill to stir. So she may already have been in failing health by then. The last mention of her in the financial records is in 1276, when the sheriffs of no fewer than 7 counties, which gives a sense of her financial reach, were ordered to produce the debts of Licoricia. 1276, of course, came after the Statute of Jewry, where basically her loans were being cancelled and she was probably having difficulty calling in those loans. But things were very, very bad financially by that point. That's not quite the last we hear of her, because one spring morning in 1277, so just 2 years after the Statute of Jewry was issued, her daughter or daughter-in-law, Belia, arrived at her house in Jewry Street to find that her mother had been stabbed to death. And the body of Licoricia's Christian maid, who was called Alice Bicton, lay close by, also murdered alongside her mistress. According to the contemporary account, both Licoricia and Alice had been killed by a blow to the chest made by a knife to the heart. So they'd been stabbed at close quarters, and it's pretty horrific when you stop and think about it. The news was reported as far as Germany. Her sons Asher and Cockerell called for a public inquiry into the death, which they paid for, but the trial was stitched up, and no murderer, no motive for the murderer was ever sort of pinned down, and no one was ever arrested. So this guy called a sort of local saddler, poor local saddler called Ralph, the blame was pinned on him, but he had conveniently already vanished. So they just basically found somebody who wasn't there and said, "Oh, we'll blame it on him." So it's not very convincing as a trial. The only good thing about Licoricia's death, horrible way to die, but the only good thing about her death was she was spared the kind of misery really of knowing what happened to her children and grandchildren. 2 years later, the King, Edward I, issued the coin clipping trials, which was basically, again, an excuse for a Jewish witch hunt. It was a sort of pogrom. And 600 Jews, almost every family in the country, Jewish family in the country was affected. Over 300 Jewish people were executed on coin clipping charges, including Licoricia's most successful son, Benedict, and one of his sons, Lombard. So a son and grandson were executed on these sort of largely trumped up charges of coin clipping. Only a few years after that, only 13 years after that, a decade after that, you have the mass imprisonment of the whole Jewish community, which we know Asher was caught up in, and that's where we have his graffiti from. And then only 3 years after that, you have the expulsion of the Jews, the Edict of Expulsion, Edward's final act of ghastliness towards the Jewish community, the mass expulsion. England was not only the first country to come up with the blood libel, it invented the blood libel in 1144 in Lincoln. It was not only the first country to come up with imposing the wearing of a badge, European country, to impose the wearing of a badge on its Jewish population in 1222 at the Oxford Synod. It was also the first country to expel its entire Jewish community en masse in 1290. And amongst the Jewish people fleeing the country would have been Licoricia's remaining sons, children, grandchildren, and possibly even grandchildren. So we don't know what happened to them, but we know that her family there were descendants of hers who would have fled the country. And this is a picture of the expulsion, but in fact, the memory of the expulsion of the Jews lived on after them. This is from the Rochester Chronicle, created in 1355, so 60 years later in the British Library. And you can see this picture in the bottom here. This is a depiction of the expulsion. Pictures of Jews also survived in cathedrals and statuary and stained glass windows. This is a picture from Winchester Cathedral, from the Chapel of the Holy Sepulchre, and you can see a Jewish person here in his pointed hat. In case you're wondering, of course, Jews in England didn't wear the pointed hat, but the artists who were probably brought over by the Bishop of Winchester to make these paintings probably came from Spain. We think that they're very similar in style to Spanish painters, and where they did wear the pointed hat. So that probably explains why you've got Jews in pointed hats in England where they didn't wear pointed hats. But the point is that the myths of Jews, the caricatures of Jews, the negative stereotypes of Jews lived on after the expulsion. And I think one of the things about Licoricia's story, and there are several things about her that I think are so interesting and so worth remembering. Let's get off this image. Let's not stay on an anti-Semitic image. Is that she was a woman of her age, but she was also kind of pretty inspiring character in terms of how determined she was to just break the mold, really, to do what she wanted to do as a woman, as a Jew in a country that would have been pretty prejudiced against both. So she's somebody who achieved what she did in spite of the constraints of her age. But she's also, I think her story is also really important for two reasons. One, because it reminds us how easily these hostile environments can be sort of stoked and fueled. How quickly and easily hostility towards a group within a society can be kind of whipped up into a really murderous state. And I think it's really important at this point in time that we remember that. But the second thing that's important about her story is that I think she reminds us about the real impact of medieval anti-Semitism on Jewish people. And that's important for me because the seeds of medieval anti-Semitism have continued to flourish across the centuries, not just in England, but in Europe as well. And I think if we really, if we want to deal with the challenge of anti-Semitism now, we do need to understand this past. It's not just a kind of something irrelevant that happened 8 centuries ago. These two of the key elements of modern anti-Semitism are with us still. The very pernicious association of Jews and money, which is still there, and these negative stereotypes around Jews and money. So these were things that were created in England, in medieval England, as a result of Jews' involvement and participation in the feudal economy, which then have just taken root, and they're still there. So the past isn't irrelevant. It's very, very relevant. And Licoricia and her family and what happened to them reminds us of the real impact on real people then as well as now. So I will shut up now and take some questions. And thank you for listening. And I hope you'll get a chance to buy the book at some point. It is available, I think, on Amazon, or will be very, very soon. You can certainly place pre-orders if you're interested. And it's got pictures. It's got pictures. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Would you like to take down the screen share? Thank you very much. That's absolutely super. Well, that really was interesting. We're certainly glad we didn't debate 100 years ago. Now, Rebecca is prepared to take questions. If you'd like to maybe use the reactions button, you can raise your hands, you'll come to the top, and I'll be able to see that you wish to ask a question. So, has anyone got any questions? Eve and Tony, would you like to ask a question?
Where do the names like Licoricia and some of the others come from? Because they don't appear to be Hebrew names.
No. No, so they did have, some of them had Hebrew names, but but they mostly had sort of anglicized versions of Hebrew names, or French, much more commonly French names. So the Jewish community in medieval England originally came from Rouen in Normandy with William the Conqueror when he conquered, and they had French names. So common names were things like I'm now not going to be able to remember it, but Belacet and Dieudonné, you know, God-given. So they often had French names. Now, Licoricia is a sort of, it was an unusual sort of fashion which existed at the beginning of the 13th century to give girls these sort of rather exotic names. So other names that were around at that time were Saffronia and Almondia. So it's a bit like calling your daughter Nutmeg now, or something like that, you know, Rosemary. I don't know, but it was just a brief fashion, and we don't. I think we only know one other Licoricia, and we don't know whether it's the same Licoricia or a different Licoricia. But that name didn't take off. Licoricia basically is the French, the Old French for licorice, which means sweet root. So it was a French name, and they mostly had French names or versions of French names.
Thank you very much.
Anyone else got anything that they'd like to ask? I have to say that I think it's absolutely wonderful that there is a statue. Memorial to Kate. It really was a very, very bold move. I believe someone's tried to attack it already, which was always one of the dangers.
Yeah, well, they don't know whether that was, I don't think it's been established if that was anti-Semitic or just hooligan or just
general vandalism.
Yeah.
Jonathan Lux has a question. Jonathan, would you like to unmute yourself first? You'd like to, if you can just unmute yourself, go to the bottom left-hand corner where it says mute, press on that. Okay, right. You've unmuted. Carry on.
Thank you. Excellent talk. Thank you very much. The expulsion in 1290, where did the Jews of England go to?
Well, so some went to France, and some went to northern France, some went to the south of France, but France then expelled all its Jews a year later. So France wasn't a particularly hospitable place at that time. Some went to the Rhineland, which is in fact where there was again quite strong trading links between the Jews of Normandy and the Jews of the Rhineland. And then we don't really know. So what's really sad is that it was such a sort of depleted community at that point. They were so poor, mostly women and orphans. So many of the men had been killed in the coin clipping pogrom in the 1270s. And anyone who could afford to leave the country had left in the 1280s because things were just so impossible. So those who were left were really the poorest of the poor, and they just sort of vanished without trace. So we don't really know where they went. They just sort of became submerged into the communities they went back to. So we don't have very much evidence at all about where they went, I'm afraid.
I can't see anyone else that's got their hands up. So I would like to ask Marion Summerfield. Marion, if you'd like to unmute yourself and give a vote of thanks on behalf of all present.
Rebecca, thank you very much for a fabulous talk. It was completely fascinating. You've drawn such a picture of what life was like then, and we've gained a lot from that, and I'm sure the book must be amazing. So on behalf of all of us, thank you very, very much.